Hello, my dear friends. Imagine a medieval town just before dawn. The streets are narrow and uneven, paved with stone that holds the cold of the night. Wooden houses lean toward each other as if listening. Smoke from hearths drifts slowly upward, mixing with the smell of animals, damp straw, and waste. This is not a place of opportunity. It is a place of watching eyes, memory, and punishment. And somewhere within this town moves a thief, careful, quiet, and already half defeated before anything is taken. Being a medieval thief was not about clever tricks or daring escapes. It was about hunger, desperation, and fear that never truly left. Theft was rarely glamorous and almost never profitable for long. Most thieves were not criminals by choice. They were peasants, laborers, servants, or displaced people pushed into stealing because survival left them no alternative. Medieval society did not create many second chances, and it punished failure harshly. A medieval town was small. Everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized faces. Strangers were noticed immediately. A thief could not disappear into a crowd because the crowd remembered. A stolen loaf of bread, a missing chicken, a vanished tool. These were not abstract losses. They were personal. The victim often knew exactly who lived nearby, who was struggling, and who might be desperate enough to steal. Suspicion traveled faster than truth. There was no professional police force as we understand it today. Instead, towns relied on community enforcement. Neighbors watched neighbors. Guild members protected their own. If a theft occurred, the entire area became alert. Doors closed. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed movement. A thief did not face one enemy, but many. Stealing itself was difficult. Locks were rare, but access was limited. Homes were small, crowded, and constantly occupied. Shops were attached to living spaces. Livestock slept close to owners. Grain stores were guarded carefully because food was survival. A thief often risked being caught in the act simply because privacy barely existed. And when a thief was caught, there was no gentle process. Accusation alone could be enough to ruin a life. Proof was flexible. Reputation mattered more than evidence. If someone was known to be poor, homeless, or previously accused, guilt followed easily. Medieval justice favored order, not investigation. Punishments for theft were severe and public. This was intentional. Authorities believed fear prevented crime better than mercy. Even small thefts could lead to brutal consequences. A stolen loaf might cost a hand. A stolen cloak might lead to branding. Repeat offenses often meant execution. The punishment was meant to hurt not only the thief but everyone watching. Public punishment was a form of education. Thieves were paraded through streets, placed in stocks, whipped, or mutilated where neighbors could watch. The pain was part of the lesson. The humiliation was permanent. A branded thief could not hide their past. A missing hand marked someone forever as untrustworthy and unemployable. This meant that even surviving punishment did not mean survival afterward. A punished thief often lost any chance of honest work. Employers avoided them. Communities rejected them. The very punishment meant to correct behavior pushed people deeper into crime or death. Medieval society rarely considered rehabilitation. Once marked, a person stayed marked. The law did not care about motive. Hunger was not an excuse. Poverty was not a defense. Medieval authorities believed theft threatened social stability. If people stole freely, trust collapsed. Markets failed. Lords lost control. Theft was treated not as a personal failing but as an attack on order itself. Because of this, thieves were often grouped with other feared figures, vagrants, beggars, outsiders. They were seen as dangerous not because of what they took, but because of what they represented. A thief reminded society how fragile survival truly was. Many thieves were caught not while stealing but afterward. Selling stolen goods was risky. Medieval economies were small and slow. Goods circulated locally. A stolen object stood out. A peasant suddenly owning better shoes. A servant offering unfamiliar jewelry. Questions followed quickly. Receivers of stolen goods were punished too. This made fences rare and untrustworthy. A thief could not rely on criminal networks. Most operated alone or with one partner. Isolation increased risk. One mistake meant exposure. Night offered limited cover. Medieval towns were dark but also quiet. Sounds carried. A footstep, a door creak, a startled animal. Any noise could wake an entire household. There were no streetlights to hide under, no crowds to blend into. Darkness protected no one completely. Religion added another layer of fear. Theft was not only illegal, it was sinful. Churches preached against it constantly. A thief risked not only punishment in life, but damnation after death. Confession offered little protection. Priests urged repentance, but authorities still punished bodies even if souls were forgiven. This constant pressure shaped the thief's life into something narrow and tense. Every day involved calculation. Who is watching? Who remembers me? Where can I go? Hunger pushed forward. Fear pulled back. Most thieves lived short, brutal lives, not because they were careless, but because the system was designed to catch them eventually. And even successful theft brought no peace. A stolen item had to be hidden, used carefully, explained. Suspicion followed closely behind. One wrong word could undo everything. As morning approached and the town began to wake, the thief retreated, empty-handed or burdened with stolen goods that might bring more danger than relief. The day would bring gossip, watchfulness, and memory. The night would bring hunger again. This was not a life of freedom. It was a life lived under pressure from every direction, and this was only the beginning. In the medieval world, theft was not treated as a moment of weakness or a mistake made under pressure. It was treated as a permanent threat to the stability of society, and because of this belief, the systems built to catch and punish thieves were harsh, persistent, and unforgiving. Once a person was suspected of stealing, their life entered a narrow corridor with very few exits, and almost all of them led toward punishment rather than escape. Medieval law was simple, local, and deeply tied to authority. Justice was not centralized in the way it is today. Each town, village, or lordship enforced its own rules, and these rules were shaped by fear of disorder. Theft threatened property, and property was the foundation of power. Landowners, guilds, and churches depended on predictable ownership. A thief challenged that predictability, and therefore challenged authority itself. This is why even minor thefts were punished severely. Mercy was seen as weakness. There was no concept of presumption of innocence. If an accusation came from a respected member of the community, it carried enormous weight. A poor person accused by a wealthy one stood almost no chance. Courts relied on oaths, reputation, and testimony rather than evidence. A thief could be convicted because neighbors believed it was Likely, they had stolen. Likelihood was enough. Communal responsibility made escape even harder. Medieval towns operated on collective obligation. If a crime occurred, the entire community was expected to respond. Bells were rung. Gates were closed. Citizens were required to pursue suspects. Refusing to help could itself be punished. This meant that once theft was discovered, a thief faced not a single pursuer, but an entire settlement mobilized against them. Travel offered little safety. Roads were dangerous, watched and slow. Inns asked questions. Villages were suspicious of newcomers. Lords demanded proof of permission to travel. A thief fleeing one town often entered another where they were immediately noticed as an outsider. Accents, clothing, and mannerisms revealed origin quickly. Blending in was nearly impossible. If captured, the process moved fast. Medieval courts did not delay punishment. Trials were brief. Defendants often had no legal representation. Confessions were encouraged through pressure, intimidation, or torture in some regions. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Denial was seen as defiance. Either response worsened the situation. Punishment was designed to be visible and permanent. Whipping, mutilation, and branding were common because they marked the body as a warning to others. A thief who lost a hand lost not only flesh, but livelihood. Manual labor was the foundation of survival. Without it, hunger followed quickly. Many punished thieves died slowly after release, unable to work and shunned by the community. Execution was not rare. Hanging, beheading, or other public deaths were used to eliminate repeat offenders or those accused of larger thefts. These executions were meant to restore balance. Authorities believed removing the thief removed the threat. There was little concern for whether desperation caused the crime. Order mattered more than cause. Children were not protected. Young thieves were punished as adults in many regions. A child stealing food could be whipped, imprisoned, or branded. Childhood was not viewed as a shield against responsibility. Early punishment was believed to prevent future crime, even if it destroyed the child's body or future. Women thieves faced additional hardship. They were punished publicly, humiliated sexually, and often accused of moral corruption alongside theft. Their reputations were destroyed permanently. Survival after punishment was rare, as women relied heavily on community acceptance for work and shelter. Imprisonment itself was brutal. Medieval prisons were not meant for rehabilitation. They were holding spaces before punishment. Conditions were dark, cold, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Food was minimal. Disease spread quickly. Many died before trial or punishment ever occurred. There was no appeal system. Once judgment was delivered, it was final. Lords and judges were rarely questioned. Authority flowed downward. A thief had no path upward. What made all of this worse was memory. Medieval communities remembered. A person once accused carried suspicion forever. Even if released, even if forgiven by the church, the label remained. People watched more closely. Opportunities disappeared. The risk of being accused again increased. This often pushed former thieves back into crime, not because they wanted to steal, but because no other survival path remained. Stealing in the medieval world was therefore not a career, not a rebellion, and not a clever game. It was a last resort taken in a system designed to destroy those who attempted it. The danger did not end when the theft succeeded. In many ways, it only began. As days passed and hunger returned, The medieval thief faced the same impossible choice again and again: steal and risk destruction, or starve quietly and disappear. Society offered no safe middle ground. Survival itself became a crime when resources were controlled by the few and guarded by fear. This was the reality of medieval theft: not daring, not cleverness, but a slow tightening trap built by law, memory, and power. In the medieval world, even after surviving accusation and punishment, the thief remained trapped inside a life shaped by constant surveillance and shrinking choices. Society did not believe punishment ended crime. It believed punishment marked a person permanently, and that mark justified lifelong suspicion. Once a thief was known or even rumored, every action afterward was interpreted through that reputation. A missing tool, a lost animal, an unpaid debt. Blame returned to the same name again and again, whether guilt existed or not. Medieval towns were built on memory rather than anonymity. There were no identity papers to reset one's past. Faces were recognized. Stories were repeated. A thief who attempted to reform faced quiet resistance everywhere. Employers refused work. Innkeepers denied beds. Markets watched hands closely. Even churches, which preached forgiveness, could not erase public knowledge. Confession cleansed the soul, but not the town's memory. This social isolation created a slow collapse. Without work, food became uncertain. Without food, desperation returned. Many former thieves stole again not because they wanted to, but because every legal path had been closed to them. This cycle was well known to authorities, yet rarely addressed. Medieval justice did not aim to restore people. It aimed to remove threats, either through fear, suffering, or death. Punishments escalated quickly for repeat accusations. A first offense might bring whipping or branding. A second could mean mutilation. A third often meant execution. Whether the crimes were equal did not matter. The pattern mattered more than the act. Authorities believed repeated theft showed moral failure beyond correction. Ending the life was considered efficient. Public executions reinforced this belief. Towns gathered to watch hangings, believing the sight strengthened order. The thief's death was presented as closure, as balance restored. There was no space for understanding cause. Hunger, war, disease, and displacement were not considered mitigating factors. Survival pressures were invisible to law. War increased theft dramatically. Armies passed through regions, destroying crops, seizing animals, and burning homes. Displaced peasants wandered in search of food. Theft became common, but punishment did not soften. In fact, fear increased. Authorities responded by enforcing laws more brutally to prevent collapse. The poorest suffered most. Famine created the same pattern. When food disappeared, theft rose. When theft rose, punishment intensified. This response deepened suffering instead of resolving it. Medieval systems lacked mechanisms to absorb crisis humanely. They relied on force because force was familiar. Thieves also faced danger from outside the law. Victims sometimes took justice into their own hands. Beatings, lynching, and mob violence occurred regularly. A suspected thief could be attacked without trial. Communities believed swift violence prevented future theft. Innocence did not guarantee safety. Night offered little relief. Medieval towns imposed curfews. Anyone found outside after dark risked arrest. A thief moving at night appeared guilty by default. Torches revealed faces. Guards questioned purpose. Silence became suspicious. Movement itself became dangerous. Rural theft carried its own risks. Farms were isolated, but landowners were armed. Stealing livestock often meant immediate violence. A thief caught in the countryside might be killed on the spot and buried quietly. Lords rarely punished those who defended property aggressively. Religion reinforced fear rather than mercy. Sermons described thieves as sinners threatening divine order. Hell was preached vividly. Fear of eternal punishment layered onto fear of earthly punishment. Even those who stole for survival were told their souls were endangered. This constant pressure reshaped identity. Many thieves stopped seeing themselves as part of society at all. They lived at its edges, avoiding towns, surviving on scraps, hiding when possible. Life became smaller, narrower, quieter. The world shrank to moments of movement and concealment. The medieval thief did not dream of freedom. Freedom required acceptance, and acceptance was impossible. Survival became the only goal, measured day by day. Aging offered no relief. Older thieves were weaker, slower, easier to catch. There was no retirement, only exhaustion. Even legends exaggerated reality. Stories of clever thieves escaping justice were rare exceptions turned into entertainment. Real life offered no such arcs. Most thieves disappeared quietly into prisons, graves, or unmarked ground. This was the hidden truth of medieval theft. It was not rebellion against wealth. It was a symptom of a rigid system that punished poverty instead of addressing it. Theft was treated as moral failure rather than social failure, and the thief paid the full price. As years passed, the cycle repeated. Hunger created theft. Theft created punishment. Punishment created deeper hunger. The system sustained itself by breaking the same people again and again. And still the medieval world believed this was order. In the medieval mind, what existed was not cruelty but structure, and that structure was defended with absolute certainty. Order was believed to come from strict boundaries, visible punishment, and fear that traveled faster than mercy. Theft threatened those boundaries because it suggested that property, status, and hierarchy were not fixed. For rulers, church leaders, and town elders, this idea was far more dangerous than the loss of stolen goods themselves. A thief was not simply someone who took. A thief was someone who proved that the system could be breached. Because of this belief, medieval society treated theft as a crime against stability rather than a response to desperation. Laws were written broadly so they could be applied harshly. Judges were given wide discretion to decide punishment based on reputation rather than circumstance. Lords used justice as a display of control, reinforcing their authority by showing that they could break bodies publicly and without apology. The suffering of the thief was meant to reassure everyone else that the rules still held. This created a world where fear shaped behavior more than morality. People did not refrain from theft because they believed it was wrong. They refrained because they had seen what happened to those who were caught. Children grew up watching punishments. They learned early that survival depended on obedience, not fairness. The sight of a branded hand or an empty sleeve was enough to end curiosity about stealing for a lifetime. Yet this fear did not eliminate theft. It only changed who took the risk. Those with the least to lose became the most vulnerable. A starving laborer risked punishment because starvation was already a slow death. A homeless widow stole because the alternative was exposure and illness. The system punished them not because they were dangerous, but because they were visible. Medieval towns rarely questioned this contradiction. Charity existed, but it was limited and conditional. Alms were given at the church door, but they were never enough to sustain life. Those who depended on charity were already marked as suspicious. If a theft occurred nearby, beggars were often blamed first. Poverty itself became evidence of criminal intent. This logic hardened social divisions. Wealth protected people from suspicion. Poor clothing, poor health, and poor reputation made accusation easier. Justice followed social lines, not objective truth. A well-connected person might steal quietly and escape notice. A poor person could be punished for merely being near missing property. Over time, this imbalance deepened mistrust within communities. Neighbors watched each other carefully. Generosity declined. People guarded possessions fiercely, not because loss was unbearable, but because accusation was dangerous. Trust eroded slowly, replaced by caution and silence. The thief became both feared and necessary, a figure that justified surveillance and authority. Even when medieval economies improved, laws did not soften. Punishment remained severe because severity had become tradition. Tradition was rarely questioned. To question punishment was to question order, and questioning order risked chaos. Few were willing to take that risk. This meant that medieval theft existed inside a closed system. Hunger led to theft. Theft led to punishment. Punishment led to exclusion. Exclusion led back to hunger. There was no mechanism to interrupt this cycle. Reform was not part of medieval thinking. Stability mattered more than solutions. The thief lived inside this loop until something ended it. Capture, execution, illness, or exhaustion. Escape was rare. Reintegration was rarer. Survival required constant movement, constant concealment, and constant fear. As decades passed, this pattern repeated so consistently that it felt inevitable. People stopped seeing thieves as individuals. They became symbols of disorder, reminders of what happened when rules were broken. Their suffering reassured those who still belonged inside the system. And so medieval society continued forward, convinced that harshness equaled strength and fear equaled peace. The suffering of thieves was not seen as tragedy, but as confirmation that the world was functioning as intended. As medieval society moved forward, the fate of the thief became even more tightly bound to systems of punishment that were designed not just to stop crime, but to leave lasting reminders carved into the human body and memory. Punishment was not meant to end at the moment pain was inflicted. It was meant to continue working long after, shaping how others behaved and how the punished person lived, if they lived at all. Execution methods for thieves were chosen for visibility and symbolism. Hanging was common because it was simple, public, and final. A body left suspended outside a town gate served as a warning long after death. Travelers saw it before they ever entered. Locals passed it daily. The message was constant. Theft ends here. In some regions, thieves were executed at crossroads, places of movement and choice, reinforcing the idea that wrong paths led only to one destination. For those not executed immediately, mutilation was often preferred. Cutting off a hand was one of the most widespread punishments. The hand that stole was removed, so it could never steal again. This logic ignored the reality that the same hand was needed to work, eat, and survive. A one-handed laborer struggled to earn food. Begging became the only option, and begging itself was criminalized in many areas. The punishment quietly became a delayed death sentence. Branding served a similar purpose. Hot irons pressed into skin marked thieves permanently. Foreheads, cheeks, shoulders, or hands were burned so that guilt could never be hidden. Even if a thief moved to a new town, the mark followed. Questions came quickly. Suspicion returned immediately. The body itself became evidence long after any crime was forgotten. Prisons did not offer relief. Medieval prisons were not designed for long-term housing or reform. They were holding spaces where bodies waited for punishment. Conditions were brutal. Cells were dark, cold, and overcrowded. Food was minimal and often depended on family support. Those without relatives starved. Disease spread easily. Rats, lice, and damp air weakened already fragile bodies. Many thieves died in prison before any sentence was carried out. Imprisonment also stripped time away. A thief might be held for weeks or months while officials decided what to do. During this time, livelihoods vanished. Fields went untended. Debts grew. Families suffered. Even release did not undo the damage. Life outside continued without the imprisoned person, and returning meant starting again with less than before. Public shaming amplified these punishments. Stocks and pillories placed thieves in town centers where they were mocked, spat on, and sometimes beaten by crowds. This humiliation was intentional. Authorities believed shame corrected behavior. In reality, it destroyed dignity and reinforced isolation. Once publicly shamed, reintegration became nearly impossible. Women thieves faced especially cruel treatment. They were often accused not only of stealing but of moral corruption. Punishments focused on humiliation as much as pain. Hair was cut, clothing torn, bodies displayed. Reputation mattered deeply for women's survival, and once destroyed, recovery was rare. Many women thieves vanished from records not because they reformed, but because they did not survive long afterward. Children caught stealing were punished to set examples. Whippings, branding, and imprisonment were used to teach fear early. Medieval society believed harshness shaped obedience. Compassion was seen as indulgence. Childhood offered little protection when property was threatened. What made all of this especially grim was the lack of finality. Even after punishment, life did not reset. A thief released from prison or spared execution returned to a world that remembered. Neighbors avoided them. Employers refused them. Markets watched them. Any future crime, even unrelated, brought harsher punishment immediately. The system assumed recurrence and acted accordingly. Over time, many thieves stopped believing survival within society was possible. They lived on the margins, moving constantly, avoiding settled life. This movement increased suspicion. Suspicion increased danger. The cycle tightened until escape required complete disappearance, something nearly impossible in a world without anonymity. Medieval authorities rarely reflected on these outcomes. The suffering of thieves was seen as necessary cost. Order mattered more than lives. Stability mattered more than fairness. The system measured success not by reduced theft, but by visible punishment and controlled fear. And so the medieval thief existed inside a structure designed to break them whether they stole again or not. Punishment did not end crime. It ended people. slowly, publicly, and with the approval of the society watching. As the years passed, the medieval thief who managed to survive punishment, imprisonment, and public shame entered the final and quietest phase of this harsh existence. This stage was not dramatic. It was slow, heavy, and defined by decline rather than sudden endings. Medieval society rarely recorded these lives because they did not end in spectacle. They faded. An aging thief carried a body already damaged by years of hunger, stress, and violence. Missing fingers, scarred skin, weakened joints, and chronic illness were common. These injuries were not treated. Medieval medicine focused on the wealthy and the connected. A marked thief had no access to care beyond herbs, prayer, and endurance. Pain became permanent. Movement became slower. Slowness increased danger. Work opportunities vanished almost completely. Manual labor required strength and trust. A thief was believed to lack both. Farmers did not want them near tools or livestock. Guilds barred them entirely. Household service was impossible because trust was central to domestic life. Even day labor was risky, as employers feared theft accusations might fall back on them. Without work, food depended on charity or theft, both increasingly inaccessible. Begging offered little relief. Medieval towns regulated begging strictly. Only those recognized as deserving poor, often the elderly or disabled with church approval, were allowed to ask for alms. A known thief begging risked arrest. Some towns whipped beggars, others expelled them. Hunger followed closely behind. Mobility also declined with age. Running from suspicion became harder. Travel required strength and endurance. Roads were long. Shelter was uncertain. An older thief stood out immediately. Weariness showed in posture and gait. Guards questioned them more aggressively. Suspicion sharpened with age rather than fading. Memory worked against survival. Communities did not forget. Even after years without theft, a person's past followed them. A missing object revived old accusations. A rumor spread faster than truth. There was no expiration on guilt. Redemption existed only in religious language, not social reality. Family ties rarely helped. Theft brought shame not only to the individual but to relatives. Families distanced themselves to protect reputation. Inheritance disappeared. Support vanished. Many thieves aged alone without care or shelter, relying on abandoned buildings, barns, or church steps to sleep. Death, when it came, was rarely noticed. An old thief might die quietly from illness, exposure, or hunger. Bodies were found late or not at all. Burials were simple or non-existent. There were no markers, no names remembered, no stories preserved. Medieval society remembered punishments, not people. This quiet ending was the final injustice. After lives shaped by fear, pain, and exclusion, there was no acknowledgement of suffering. The system that punished so visibly ended these lives invisibly. Silence replaced spectacle. Authorities viewed this outcome as success. The thief no longer threatened order. Whether through execution or slow disappearance, the problem was resolved. No reflection followed. No reform occurred. The pattern simply continued with the next desperate person. This cycle endured because medieval society believed stability required sacrifice. Those pushed to the margins were considered necessary losses. Theft was treated as moral failure rather than social consequence. Hunger was punished instead of addressed. Fear replaced understanding. The medieval thief's life therefore reveals something deeper than crime. It reveals how rigid systems respond to vulnerability, not with care, but with force, not with solutions, but with punishment that extends far beyond the original act. Stealing in the medieval world was never just about taking property. It was about entering a system designed to erase you slowly, whether through the rope, the blade, the brand, or time itself. This is why it truly sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because stealing was dangerous for a moment, but because once the label existed, the rest of life became a narrowing path with almost no place left to stand. As the life of a medieval thief continued into its later years, the pressure did not ease, and the danger did not fade. What changed was not the system, but the body and the mind of the person trapped inside it. Survival became slower, heavier, and more uncertain with every passing season. The thief no longer faced dramatic moments of capture or escape every day. Instead, they faced a quiet erosion that was just as deadly. The medieval world offered no path back into normal life once trust was broken. Trust was the foundation of everything. Work, shelter, food, and safety all depended on it. A thief existed outside that foundation. Even when theft stopped, suspicion did not. A person marked by accusation lived permanently under watch, and that watchfulness grew sharper as strength declined. Aging exposed every weakness. An older thief could no longer climb quickly, move silently, or flee if noticed. Reaction time slowed, vision weakened, hands stiffened from cold and injury. These changes were not minor inconveniences. In a society where escape depended on speed and strength, aging transformed risk into certainty. What once required skill to avoid now required luck. Luck rarely lasted. Medieval winters were especially cruel. Cold-hardened joints worsened illness and drained energy. Those without steady shelter suffered most. Thieves often relied on abandoned structures, barns, or church porches for sleep. These places offered little protection from wind, rain, or snow. Illness spread quickly. Fever, cough, infection, and weakness followed. Without medical care, recovery was uncertain. Many died slowly during winter months, unnoticed until spring. Food scarcity increased with age. Stealing became more dangerous, yet hunger remained constant. Charity was unreliable and conditional. Churches offered alms, but often demanded proof of worthiness. A known thief rarely qualified. Pride faded quickly when hunger returned, but asking for help often resulted in rejection or punishment. This forced many aging thieves into impossible decisions: risk stealing again or weaken quietly until death arrived. Violence from others became more common. Younger, stronger people exploited the vulnerability of older thieves. Beatings, theft, and abuse occurred frequently. Reporting such violence was pointless. Authorities did not protect those already considered criminals. An injured thief was assumed to deserve it. Pain went unanswered. Mental exhaustion deepened isolation. Years of fear, watching, and avoidance reshaped thought itself. The mind narrowed. Planning for the future felt meaningless. Days became focused only on immediate survival. This mental collapse was not sudden. It built slowly, reinforced by every closed door and suspicious glance. Religion offered limited comfort. While priests preached forgiveness, forgiveness did not equal acceptance. Confession cleansed the soul, but did not erase reputation. Some thieves sought solace in prayer, believing divine mercy might compensate for human cruelty. Others abandoned hope entirely, feeling condemned both in life and beyond it. Death often came quietly, not on a scaffold, not in a public square, but in forgotten corners. A body found near a wall, a figure who did not wake in the morning. Burial, if it happened, was simple. No ceremony, no memory preserved. The system that punished so loudly ended lives in silence. Medieval records rarely mention these endings. History remembers executions and laws, not quiet disappearances. This absence is itself part of the cruelty. The thief's life was considered complete once it no longer disrupted order. How it ended did not matter. This reveals the true nature of medieval punishment. It was not designed to correct behavior or restore balance. It was designed to remove problems visibly and let the rest fade away unseen. Theft was treated as contamination. The response was isolation until disappearance. The medieval thief's life, therefore, was not defined by moments of crime, but by years of exclusion. Stealing was often brief. The consequences lasted a lifetime. Even stopping did not end punishment. The system continued to apply pressure until there was nothing left to press against. This slow destruction was accepted because it maintained appearance of order. Order mattered more than lives. Stability mattered more than justice. Fear mattered more than understanding. And so the medieval world continued, confident that it had solved the problem of theft while never asking why theft kept returning generation after generation. The answer lived quietly in the margins, in bodies worn down by hunger and fear, in lives erased without acknowledgement. This was the final truth of being a medieval thief. Not that stealing was dangerous for a night, but that once marked, a person carried that danger until the very end, with no release, no return, and no recognition of suffering along the way. In the final understanding of what it meant to live as a medieval thief, the true weight of that life is found not in single moments of crime or punishment, but in the long, unbroken stretch of existence shaped entirely by exclusion. Medieval society did not view theft as an action that could be corrected or forgiven through time. It viewed it as a permanent fracture in a person's character, something that justified lifelong suspicion and endless vulnerability. Once labeled, a thief ceased to exist as a full member of society, and instead became a figure tolerated only at its edges, watched closely, blamed easily, and discarded without regret. This exclusion was not loud or dramatic in its later stages. It did not rely on public punishment anymore. It relied on neglect. The medieval thief learned that the most powerful punishment was not pain, but abandonment. There were no institutions designed to help someone rebuild trust. No structured path back into honest labor. No social mechanism for reintegration. The system assumed that fear alone would prevent theft, and when fear failed, it assumed removal was the only solution. Removal did not always mean execution. Often it meant something quieter and slower, a life lived in constant precarity until it ended on its own. The longer a thief survived, the more invisible they became. Youth brought danger, but it also brought movement and adaptability. Age brought invisibility, and invisibility brought neglect. Medieval towns were busy places, but attention was selective. People noticed strength, productivity, and usefulness. They ignored those who no longer contributed. An aging thief, weakened by hunger and years of strain, blended into the background not because they were accepted, but because they were no longer worth noticing. This invisibility removed even the limited protection that visibility once offered. Without stable shelter, the thief's life followed the rhythms of weather. Rain-soaked clothing and bedding. Cold stiffened joints and slowed movement. Heat drained energy and worsened illness. Each season brought its own risks, and without resources, adaptation was minimal. Illness lingered longer. Injuries healed poorly. Small problems became fatal because there was no buffer against them. Medieval society provided no safety net for those it had already judged. The emotional toll of this life was just as severe as the physical one. Constant vigilance reshaped the mind. Trust faded completely. Even acts of kindness were met with suspicion, because kindness often came with conditions or scrutiny. The thief learned to accept help cautiously, knowing it could disappear at any moment. This emotional isolation hardened into resignation. Hope became dangerous because it invited disappointment. Survival required emotional restraint as much as physical endurance. What makes this reality especially harsh is that medieval society believed it was functioning correctly. The suffering of thieves was not seen as evidence of failure, but as confirmation that the system worked. Those who survived honestly were proof of virtue. Those who failed were proof of moral weakness. This belief prevented reflection. If a thief died quietly of hunger or illness, it was not considered a tragedy. It was considered the natural outcome of poor choices. Yet the medieval world depended on this cycle. Poverty, displacement, war, and famine created desperation regularly. Desperation produced theft. Theft justified punishment. Punishment reinforced authority. Authority maintained order, at least on the surface. The thief was both a product of the system and the excuse for its harshness. Without thieves, the system would have had to confront its own rigidity. With thieves, it could continue unchanged. History rarely records these lives because they did not challenge power in visible ways. They did not lead rebellions. They did not leave monuments. They simply endured until they could not. This absence from records is itself a form of erasure, a final act of exclusion that continues long after death. We know medieval thieves existed in great numbers, yet we know almost nothing about their individual lives, because the system that punished them also denied them memory. To understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval thief, one must look beyond crime and punishment and see the entire structure that surrounded those acts. Theft was not a brief deviation. It was the beginning of a long descent into a life defined by fear, exclusion, and inevitability. Even when the hand stopped stealing, the label remained active, shaping every interaction and every possibility. This is what medieval justice created. Not safety, not fairness, but a steady process of removal that allowed society to believe it was orderly while quietly discarding those it could not or would not support. The medieval thief lived inside this process from the moment of accusation until the final, unmarked ending, and there was no point along the way where relief truly arrived. As the medieval world continued to turn, the figure of the thief remained locked in the same position, unmoving while everything else slowly shifted around them. Kings changed, wars began and ended, towns grew, shrank, or vanished. Yet the treatment of theft stayed remarkably consistent, because it was tied not to law alone, but to fear deeply rooted in medieval thinking: fear of scarcity, fear of disorder, fear that survival itself was fragile and could collapse if rules softened even slightly. In this world, property was not simply ownership, it was identity. Land defined status, tools defined livelihood, food defined life. To take any of these was to threaten more than comfort. It was to threaten existence. This belief justified extreme responses, and it meant that even when theft caused little real harm, the punishment remained severe. The system responded not to damage done, but to danger imagined. This fear shaped how communities interacted with suspected thieves long before any crime occurred. People watched patterns: who lingered near markets, who moved at odd hours, who asked too many questions. Poverty itself became suspicious behavior. A person who looked hungry attracted attention. A person who dressed poorly was watched more closely. The thief did not need to act to be noticed. Existence alone invited scrutiny. This constant observation created a world where privacy barely existed. Medieval homes were small and crowded. Streets were narrow. Sounds traveled. People lived close together. A person could not disappear inside a city. Rural areas offered isolation, but also increased risk. A lone figure near a farm raised alarm immediately. Either environment made theft dangerous, but also made false accusation easy. Once suspicion attached itself to someone, it rarely left. Suspicion functioned like a shadow, following movement, coloring interpretation, shaping response. A thief who entered a market was not just shopping. They were watching. A thief who stood quietly was hiding something. A thief who spoke was distracting. There was no neutral behavior once reputation existed. This is why many medieval thieves lived nomadic lives, constantly moving in hopes of escaping memory. But movement itself became suspicious. Travelers were questioned. Passes were demanded. Lords controlled roads and bridges. Toll collectors remembered faces. Inns shared information. A moving thief left traces everywhere, and each trace increased risk. The lack of anonymity meant that escape required total disappearance, something nearly impossible without resources. A person could not change their name easily. Accents revealed origin. Skills revealed background. Bodies carried marks of labor and punishment. The medieval world remembered through people rather than records, and people remembered well. Violence from authorities was only one danger. Violence from ordinary citizens was constant. A suspected thief could be attacked without warning. Justification came easily. Protection did not exist. Guards often arrived after the damage was done, if they arrived at all. Injuries went untreated. Justice did not compensate victims of mob violence. Survival depended on avoiding attention entirely. This environment trained thieves to minimize presence, to speak less, to move less, to exist less. Life shrank inward. Days blurred together, marked not by achievement, but by avoidance. Avoid this street. Avoid this person. Avoid this time of day. Survival became a process of subtraction. Medieval culture reinforced this through stories and sermons. Thieves were described as morally broken, weak-willed, corrupt. These narratives justified harsh treatment. They also erased complexity. Hunger, displacement, illness, and war disappeared from explanation. The thief became a symbol rather than a person. This symbolic role mattered. It allowed society to externalize its anxieties. Instead of confronting structural scarcity, communities blamed individuals. Instead of questioning unequal distribution, they punished visible desperation. The thief became a vessel for collective fear, and punishing them offered emotional relief. Over time, this dynamic hardened into tradition. Laws became rituals. Punishments became performances. Memory replaced inquiry. Medieval society stopped asking whether harshness reduced theft and focused instead on whether harshness looked strong enough to deter it. Appearance replaced outcome. The thief, trapped within this system, lived under constant tension. Every decision carried risk. Steal and risk punishment. Do not steal and risk starvation. Trust and risk betrayal. Hide and risk isolation. There was no safe option, only less dangerous ones. What made this especially cruel was the absence of conclusion. There was no moment where the thief could say the danger had passed. Even years without theft did not erase suspicion. Even visible suffering did not inspire mercy. The system did not believe in redemption. It believed in containment until disappearance. This meant that the medieval thief's life rarely followed an arc. There was no rise, fall, and resolution. There was only persistence until exhaustion. The body weakened. The mind narrowed. The world became smaller. Eventually, something ended it. Not necessarily law, often time. And while these lives ended quietly, the system that shaped them continued loudly, confident that it had done its job, unaware or uninterested in the cost paid by those it had pushed beyond the edge. By the end of this long and difficult path, the life of a medieval thief did not arrive at redemption, understanding, or resolution. It simply reached exhaustion. The system did not seek to teach thieves how to live differently, nor did it aim to reduce the conditions that produced theft in the first place. Its only goal was containment, removal, and reassurance for those who remained inside accepted society. In that sense, the thief's suffering was never a failure of medieval order. It was evidence in medieval eyes that the order was working exactly as intended. The medieval world believed deeply in fixed roles. Lords ruled, peasants worked, clergy prayed. Anyone who fell outside these roles became a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. The thief occupied one of the most dangerous positions because theft challenged the idea that property and hierarchy were permanent. Even a single stolen object suggested instability, and instability frightened a society already living close to scarcity. What makes this history especially grim is that the system learned nothing from repetition. Theft did not disappear. Hunger did not disappear. Displacement caused by war, plague, and famine returned again and again. Each crisis produced more thieves, and each generation responded with the same punishments, convinced that harsher enforcement would finally solve the problem. It never did. The cycle continued because the cause was never addressed. The medieval thief therefore became a recurring figure, appearing wherever resources were uneven and survival was uncertain. These individuals were not rebels seeking to overturn society. They were ordinary people pushed into extraordinary risk by necessity. Yet the system refused to see necessity. It saw only threat. Justice in this world was not about balance, it was about demonstration. Public punishment reassured the majority that rules still held. The pain of the thief became proof that order existed. This belief allowed society to look away from suffering without guilt. The spectacle absorbed responsibility. Over time, this shaped how medieval people understood morality itself. Goodness became associated with obedience rather than compassion. Crime became associated with character rather than circumstance. Once these ideas settled, cruelty felt reasonable, even righteous. The thief's suffering no longer disturbed the conscience, it confirmed it. The final cruelty was invisibility. Once a thief stopped being useful as an example, they disappeared from record and concern. Death outside a scaffold did not matter. A body lost to cold or illness did not threaten order. Silence replaced spectacle, and silence was enough. Looking back, the life of a medieval thief reveals not just the harshness of past law, but the fragility of societies built on fear rather than support. Theft was treated as a moral disease instead of a social symptom, and the treatment reflected that misunderstanding. Pain replaced prevention. Punishment replaced care. Memory replaced reform. This is why it truly sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because stealing was risky for a moment, but because once marked, a person carried that risk every day, in every interaction, until there was nothing left to risk. The system did not allow return. It allowed only endurance, disappearance, or death. And so the history closes here, not with justice restored, but with a clearer understanding of how medieval order maintained itself by sacrificing those it could not fit into its rigid structure. The thief's life was the cost of that order, paid quietly, repeatedly, and without recognition. If you enjoyed this slow, deep dive, boring history like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which forgotten medieval or ancient life you want explored next in a long, calm, monster-length episode. We'll meet again, in another place, in another time, with another hidden history.